Yeah, we're just talking off air about living in certain different places. So yeah, we're in North Carolina right now. So if the Wi-Fi is a little shoddy, we'll see what's up. But otherwise, you'll probably catch us doing another kind of venture out to Colorado to see what it's like there. Mostly just to hit a lift and head over to N1 and do some lengthened work on like a vertical lat machine. But yeah, can't maybe relocating our entire family just to be closer to like the N1 and stuff. But obviously that's tongue in cheek. But when we head out there, we'll have to hit a hike or something.
Yeah, I'm lobbying super hard for the Lipses to end up in Boulder, but
Yeah,
I also feel somewhat confident that N1 isn't going to be here forever. So,
true, true,
I don't
true.
think that would be a big reason to move here. There's
Definitely.
many other quality reasons to be in
Sure,
Boulder.
for sure. A million. Yeah. Cool. We're obviously chatting about failure training today. There was a paper released by people. I know that both of us are love the dudes from Data Driven Strength. Zach and Josh both been on our podcast, I believe. Super smart. A bunch of other people on that paper too. And you're the guest. We'll bounce back and forth, but just give us like a little bit of like, hey, here's kind of what this what they did, and here's we'll go back and forth on a little bit of what they found, but like, why is this paper this all the rage right now?
Yeah, I mean, essentially what they did is they did a meta-analysis, more or less, a meta-regression, kind of the same idea. And they looked at all the studies and they found that for hypertrophy, there's more stimulus when you get closer to failure. And I don't think that should be a huge surprise to too many people. I think maybe the surprise would be that there didn't seem to be a notable increase in fatigue that would mask the stimulus potentially as you get closer to failure. And so I think in prior iterations of this idea within the industry, we had a lot more of the, well, if you go too close to failure, you get too much fatigue and then, your whole fucking rest of your week is screwed or whatever. So that's one thing obviously to discuss. But and then I guess for strength, they didn't find that at all. And then one other interesting thing they found was that for hypertrophy, it didn't even seem to matter if you went to failure for like sets of 5 to 8 so much. As I actually think in some ways that's proof of concept for the effective reps model of like, hey, if that shit is hard from the very first rep,
Yeah.
then you probably don't need to go all the way to failure versus when you're doing 15 plus reps. Not only is, you got to get through these kind of ineffective reps to get to the effective ones, but then you have the ambiguity of whether you're actually at failure because your muscles are failing or that stuff just hurts so much that you don't want to continue. So that would be my general overview. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, they whatever, they looked at a ton of studies that used RIR. And by the way, for those listening, I'm gonna have Zach and Josh, two of the authors on the paper, come on. They've been on the podcast before. They're awesome. So Bryan and I today are not going to do a deep dive into like the study methodology and deep into the limitations, which I think we'll touch on a little bit because they affect kind of our takeaways. But as far as getting like a full-on, more scientifically literate breakdown of exactly how it was done, we're going to have Zach and Josh on. And essentially, I guess my big take homes were, hey, for strength gain, getting super mega close to failure versus like being a couple reps shy didn't make a difference. And in that regard, actually, they saw better results when people were a smidge further from failure with really heavy loads. And we'll talk about, there's a sentence within the strength take homes that like I can't quite figure out. It's like a brain twister. And then for hypertrophy, what they found was actually that there was a non-linear relationship, meaning that it was like even better stimulus to fatigue ratio, like getting closer to failure. Like it wasn't like linear where like 5 is just as much better as than 6, which is just as much better from 4 to 5, just as much better from 3 to 4. It actually looked like it was like actually ascending in a non-linear fashion. And so TLDR of the hypertrophy side of things was like, hey, like on a set to set basis, like you get more stimulation, more hypertrophy stimulus by going closer to failure. And I just feel like that's I read both of that. I'm not saying that you or I are both know-it-alls. We're not, but like I just that what neither of those things where it's like, hey, you don't need to go mega close to failure for strength. And I want to start with that because I think we can have a longer talk about hypertrophy because that's more of our pursuit and our audience pursuits. But we'll talk about the strength first. But the hypertrophy side of things, it's like, yeah, if you train a little bit, like if you're training harder on a set, you're gonna get more stimulus from that set. And I kind of people are like, training to failure is like the most stimulative. And I'm like, yeah, like I just feel like there was, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, where like there was this whole discussion born of, hey, if you're within 5 reps from failure, you can make equivalent gains. That is true, but there's an inverse relationship between intensity and volume, where if you're going to train with 3 to 5 RIR, you're going to have to do more sets than somebody training in, let's say, 0 to 3 RIR to equate the stimulus. And so the idea that you could get equivalent gains training from further from failure, you can. You just have to do more sets. And that second part is just always forgotten. People are like, oh, a set, like people have taken that and been like, oh, a set at 3 RIR and a set at 0 RIR are the same thing. And that 0 RIR is more fatiguing, so I'm not going to do those. And that's not at all the case. Did you have a similar like gut feeling when you kind of read the paper and how people were responding to it?
Yeah, I mean, completely. And that last statement you made about the inverse relationship of intensity and volume, that like actually bothers me constantly in the social media online space, because people are all the time sliding into my DMs being like, why are you training to failure? You can get just as good results like at 3 RIR or whatever. And I'm like, you do understand that I'm doing 2 sets and that you would have to do 4 or 5 sets if you were training at 3 RIR. And then they write back oftentimes and they're like, oh, I didn't realize that. And I'm like, really? Like, you didn't realize that? That's kind of like, it should be the main message associated with that statement. When it says you can get just as good gains with 3 RIR, it should be like asterisk, you must do more volume or something along those lines. Like, it has to be there every time. So anyway, it wasn't a surprise to me, the meta-analysis, as far as it relates to hypertrophy, because I think it's stuff that like you or I or anybody in the game for long enough, we can feel that like within a set, we can feel there's more stimulus there when you go to failure, and you can feel that you can probably get a similar stimulus doing 2 or 3 sets with some RIR as you would to that one set that you really took to the house. And so I mean, maybe that's some of it to speak to the fact that we just are experienced and we know our bodies and we're self-aware and all that stuff. But I mean, it should make sense conceptually as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's like I suspect if I were on the other side of the argument, kind of arguing a little bit more in favor of training on average a smidge further from failure, my argument would have to come from a maximizing stimulus to fatigue ratio. And I think the further you move towards 0 RIR, maybe you'd probably be arguing from an efficiency standpoint. I don't know that we know yet that there's a sweet spot of stimulus to fatigue ratio. This paper tends to give off the interpretation that it would be closer to failure, that actually that's where the best SFR would be. That one of the limitations that is acknowledged by the authors is that this was an acute study. The studies were about 8 weeks long, and so there's nothing that we can really know about how long-term accumulations or adaptations to fatigue would happen over the long term. But I think that a lot of people are like, wow, learning for the first time that there's more, you can get more stimulus per set training to failure. And I just want to start by saying like that, whatever, it shouldn't be news to people, but if it is news to people, that's awesome. I think that they're like, I think you and I are knee deep in the pursuit of efficiency. And if this gets more people to be like, hey, more stimulus per set by training to failure, maybe I can decrease the amount of time I'm spending in the gym. Like, it's funny because I was talking about a podcast recently, like all of the lengthened work and training to failure stuff that's coming out, I have no interest in packaging that stuff into how to optimize gains. I only have it from a laziness lens of like, these are both ways for me to get more stimulus per set such that I can do less sets and still make X amount of gains, however much, I want at that time. And so I'm pumped for it, as much as it's like a small eye roll of like, yeah, we kind of should have suspected this already. Like, I'm pumped for another like feather in the cap of like efficiency from an efficiency perspective.
Yeah. I actually have like a mini theory that part of the reason we're seeing this further from failure for the strength work is that it's focusing entirely on these massive, large compound movements like deadlift, squat, bench press, multi-joint movements, right? Extending multiple joints. And when you're looking at this meta-analysis or meta-regression that was done by these guys, it's a combination of studies that include compound movements and isolation movements. But I wonder if, that whole idea of if you're doing sets of 5 to 8 reps, you don't really need to be at failure because you're getting enough stimulus, from the first
can I
few
pause
reps.
you real quick? So can I
Yeah,
pause
yeah.
you? Because I know I just want to say that one of the other takeaways that I think you're going to address a little bit was that from a rep range perspective, that working at lower reps with heavier loads, you didn't have to go as close to failure, and working with lighter weight at higher reps, you had to get closer to failure. That was kind of another one of the take homes. And so go ahead.
Yeah. So as I was saying, like because you're not going to be performing lateral raises and bicep curls in like the 5 to 8 rep range generally, I think that most of that is a result of the compound movements. And so then if you would kind of extrapolate that out a little bit further, I'm still of the belief, like if someone were to ask me, like, should I train my squats and RDLs to failure? I'm almost unequivocally going to tell you in most cases, no, you probably shouldn't go to failure on those movements. And that is partially a product of the fact that we do tend to train those in lower rep ranges. But I probably wouldn't even tell anyone to go to failure on an RDL or a back squat in the 12 to 15 rep range. And so I just wonder how much of that information that we're seeing between the strength and the hypertrophy and between the low rep ranges and the high rep ranges really has to do with exercise selection more than anything else.
The improvement in strength performance so essentially they found that if you train a couple reps shy from failure, people on average got stronger faster than if they trained all the way to failure. I also feel I see what you're saying, where it kind of self-selects. If you're taking studies that are looking at lower rep ranges, on average those studies probably have more compound lifts than isolation lifts, and so you're kind of looking at two things, even though you think you're just looking at one. Part of me thinks that there's a technique discussion there too, because I think if you're trying to develop like strength in and of itself is a neurological adaptation. Obviously, having more muscle mass is a big contributor to how much you can lift. But getting maximally attaining neurological adaptations probably doesn't happen. Like probably not requires, but it's probably best done with repeated similar motor patterns, where if you go very, very close to failure, you get a lot of grindy reps. That tends to be where you deviate from that perfect technique. And so I'm not so surprised that, if you take people in these studies and you're training them to failure on really heavy compounds, you're going to see a lot of technique breakdown. And I'm not surprised that maybe that technique breakdown is actually inhibiting them from getting maximally stronger, where like 1 or 2 RIR probably means that your whole set was really dialing in that motor pattern, and it was close enough, and the net of those two things probably led to better strength gains. It's like what you might get in stimulus from that last rep or two, you might lose adaptation wise in terms of strength expression, because your technique is breaking down, you're not ingraining those like really high quality motor patterns. And the net of that might be just you're going to get stronger slower. And so that tends to be what I'm imagining. I'm blanking on how trained all of the people were in the paper. I believe that I have it written down. Do you recall?
I'm pretty sure it was just a mix of whatever studies were available. Yeah.
So I'm even more sus of like people training back squats and deadlifts and compounds to failure in terms of strength. So like, with good technique.
Yeah, I think it's you didn't say it in these exact words, but it's like as you get close to failure and you're doing those grindy reps, there's like mini unintended compensations occurring. And so like, yeah, the motor pattern neurologically that you're trying to groove, it gets misgrooved kind of. It'd be like if you're trying to work on your sprint technique, but you've done 1,000 sprints and now you're not actually sprinting properly. You're now just creating like bad habits sort of.
No, absolutely. There's a reason that whatever, we can go into the sprinting is a great example, that if you are looking to gain neurological adaptations, power and strength adaptations, that you do them earlier in the workout under less fatigue. I mean, that's the entire premise of gaining neurological adaptations, is you don't necessarily, like a sprinter is not practicing sprinting under really high amounts of fatigue where technique's going to change. That is a worse way to do that. And so, yeah, that's certainly something I saw as well. I guess we'll stay on strength for a sec. We'll move to hypertrophy, but there's a statement that, and then I watched like Lane did like a little recap video the other day. I didn't know Zach coached him, by the way. That's super cool.
Yeah, that's awesome, right?
And it said that Lane said a couple times, he's like, it's not necessarily about the getting close to failure. It's about the lifting heavy part. The words exactly was like, I don't have the exact quote. I wrote a comment about it, but essentially like, oh, you need to, it's the lifting the heavy weights and lifting progressively heavier weights that matters. And I'm like, can we just say that like he was trying to say that if you needed to, if you were lifting like sets of, if you were going to do 300 pounds and you could do that for one set of 5, but you'd be better off doing like 10 sets of 2 or something like that. And I was like, what really matters for strength is that just like everything, that you're progressively overloading it. Like, I mean, like it just didn't make a lot of sense to me. I'm like, hey, what's important for strength is that you're progressively lifting heavier loads. Like, duh. And I wasn't necessarily sure where they were going with that. He's like, oh, it's just important to lift heavy weight. I'm like, yeah, it's important to lift heavy weight and over time push yourself to lift heavier weight. And I was like, okay, like it's progressive overload then. Like, did you catch any of that in there?
I didn't watch the lane thing.
Cool.
But my guess would be that it's just like a means to an end. Like, hey, if you do all these sets of 2, it's going to increase your neurological efficiency. You're going to get more out of it than you would the other way. And therefore it will lead to progressive overload and lifting more weight over time.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. I want to talk about this idea that, and you even said it, and I kind of agree, but I'm interested in what you think about this. So this idea of I think at the end of the day, there's more nuance to this. When we talk about training to failure, like that was originally just like a thing that we would say, training to failure. We wouldn't identify what really failure meant. We wouldn't acknowledge the multitude of different ways to apply that word contextually. We wouldn't really think about it in terms of differences in exercises, but intuitively people would say things like, hey, don't take your compounds as close to failure, take your isolation stuff to failure. So I think intuitively there was this understanding of there's a difference between exercises. And so when we talk about this idea of like, maybe don't go so close on compounds, or maybe you don't have to go so close on compounds. And I want to circle back around to the rep range. I'm going to make a note that we don't rep range discussion. Because I think that's another one of like another feather in the cap of like, maybe you don't do as many sets of 20 to 30, but we'll come back around. But when people say maybe you don't need to go as close to failure on your compounds, I think of compounds, and technically the definition of compounds is a multi-joint movement, right? And so it's like a lat pull, like an overhead pull down is technically a compound lift. And so I know that we can be a bit pedantic, and when people like heavy compounds, they're like squat, bench, deadlift. It's like there's a lot of things that are compounds. And so what about compound lifts makes people say this? And I'll give you a couple options. Is it that most of the compound lifts, or many of them, are overloaded in the lengthened position? Is it the fact that compounds work multiple joints? Is it like, oh, because it works multiple joints, you don't need to go as close to failure? Or is it because it's overloaded in the lengthened position, you don't need to go as close to failure? Or is it because in compound lifts, yes, there's multiple joints, but there's a lot of tissue that's worked often, technically, a lat pull down, I would argue like a glute bridge, the glutes might be bigger than all of those muscles being worked potentially, whatever. But on compound lifts, there's a lot of tissue being worked. Do I not need to go close to failure because there's a lot of tissue being worked? Is it due to the fact that some of these compound lifts have high amounts of axial load, like high amounts of loading of the spine? And I just think of the word compound, and not all compound lifts meet all those requirements. And so what are we really saying if we're going to give a little bit more nuance of like, hey, these exercises, maybe you don't need to / shouldn't go as close to failure. And then we'll look at the other side of like, hey, maybe in these circumstances, we lean into that a little bit more. But what is it about the compounds? Is it because they're lengthened overloaded? They're not all. Is it because they work multiple joints? Okay, they all do that, but is that relevant? Is it because they work a lot of tissue? Is that relevant? Or is it because they have, some of them, have high amounts of axial load? And would you recommend us be a bit more specific than just saying compounds, even though, okay, maybe in just like a throwaway sentence, it's a fine place to start?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a little bit of all of them. It made me laugh when you said that, because we constantly have people in our group writing and being like, why doesn't this cycle have any of the compounds in it? And I'm like, the compounds, like we have all of these different presses and like pulls and stuff.
Split squats and RDLs.
Yeah, exactly. RDLs and leg press. Right, exactly. But it's not squat, bench, dead. So honestly, I think it's all of the things you mentioned. It's lengthened, it's axial loading, it's tons of tissue. The one that I would exclude from that would be the ones that are short overloaded. So by itself, it seemed like lengthened is important, but lengthened isn't the only thing, because then you would say that like an overhead tricep extension is also one of these like super fatiguing movements, which isn't the idea. It's got to be axially loaded, works tons of tissue, multi-joint, and lengthened overloaded. And then you get this like milieu, this perfect recipe for not having to go super close to failure.
I think I would add on that list a lack of stability and a likelihood of technique breakdown. So when I think of like the multiple joints thing, like I'm not really sure how that's relevant outside of it kind of telling me, okay, if I'm moving multiple joints and I don't have a lot of stability, then that's probably a recipe for a likelihood of these subtle technique shifts as I get very close to failure. That to me is the biggest one. It's like working really close to failure on an RDL probably would be on our list of like, okay, on average, on a spectrum, we can be a little further from failure, or would recommend doing that. And I think that that's, if we dissect the RDL, it's overload in the lengthened position, right? Works a fuck ton of tissue, lacks stability. You know, it's not a leg press, right? Leg press, I think of a leg press, it hits all of these except the axial load and stability. RDL has no stability, has axial load, loads the spine, works a ton of tissue, multiple joints, length and overload, a very high likelihood of technique adjustment. I mean, by the end of your 0 RIR RDL, if I come in and start screaming to you, you can probably do more, but you're going to bend your knees more, you're going to flex at the spine, you might not go as low. There's so many opportunities for you to modify your technique to continue the set. And I think that to me is like the big one of like, yeah, I think the RDL is the perfect storm of, I don't probably need to go as close to failure, because failure is super incredibly hard to actually identify where it is, because I have such an opportunity to move my knees a little bit more, to go, you know, a little bit not as deep, and start to modify my technique to get more.
Yeah. I mean, I honestly think you could probably like do 5 perfect reps and then still get 5. Like you could be at failure of perfect form at 5, and then you could end up getting 10. And it's like your 10th one clearly doesn't look like it, but it happens gradually rep to rep.
Yeah. And so I think if we're looking at like the compound, like if I was to not nitpicking, because I think saying compounds like kind of it gets most of these right most of the time. But if we're looking at exercises where I think you don't need to go as close to failure to get near maximal results, it probably would be multi-joint movements that are overloaded in the length position, that lack stability, and that load the spine. Yeah. And are ripe for like technique micro adjustments as you get close to failure. I think that kind of goes into play there.
I have no problem with taking like a pendulum or like a hack squat or a leg press or something like that to failure. I could see that being following that model of being more stimulative as you get to, and I guess even past failure, if you want to try like a bottom partial or something like that.
Yep. And on the flip side, we can flip all of these and say, when we have the opposite of these, that it is safer to push close to failure, and you're more likely to have that stimulus be localized to the place you want it. So you have exercises that are harder in a short position, that work, or single joint movement, that don't load the spine and provide a ton of stability. Now, you don't have to have all of them for us to say, okay, this is a safe spot, or that we do want to go close to failure. And taking, let's say, all of that and say, okay, it doesn't overload the short, it overloads the lengthen. So we have the leg press. The leg press is multi-joint movement, heavier in the lengthen position, lots of tissue, doesn't load the spine, has a ton of stability. So we have 2 things going for it. Now you can say, okay, I look at the leg press and I look at it in the middle ground of like, it's safe to work close to failure, but it will also fuck you up more than maybe a leg extension to failure. And so we have to, not that it needs to get so complicated, but for those who want to kind of learn a little bit more about this, if you have these categories, the more boxes that are checked, the more you need to identify, okay, like what is going to happen if I go to failure? Going to failure on an RDL, I look at as potentially the worst. I mean, not a bad thing, not the end of the world. When I say failure, I mean well into several reps where I probably would have had you stop because technique has changed so much. But then you get all of that stability in a leg press. And so, okay, maybe if I'm in an RDL, I'm just if we're looking at it on a spectrum, maybe an RDL, I'm like, hey, I'm in that like 1 to 4. And then if I'm in the leg press, I'm in that like 0 to 3. And I start to see this spectrum, and that spectrum for me and for you, I know, has now moved into negative numbers, where there's exercises where I'm like, I gotta keep going, right? Like I just gotta keep going. So what are some exercises where you feel like I would really lean into pushing into failure and potentially into negative RIR air quotes of partials, and what might be some of the, again, so the opposite of these things that come to mind?
Yeah, a movement where the strength curve and resistance curve both are short. I just like it just feels like nothing's happening if you don't go at least to failure and beyond. So you can look at your like dumbbell lateral raise or your dumbbell row. Any of those two are great examples. Yeah, I mean those are probably the two that stand out the most to me.
Yeah. Do you feel like these days? I didn't I guess I wasn't as just aware back in the day. When I'm doing back work or I'm doing leg extensions that the machine is just hardest in the short position, I'm just so much more aware now that there's just so much more stimulus I'm leaving on the table in that set. And provided I have the stability, like a chest support or a leg extension, I'm just starting to be like, wow, it's like so tangible that I have many more reps in me for just what feels like in the moment, no extra cost, maybe local, like some local pain, but like, we did lat pull downs today, Jenna and I just was like, I'm secure in the seat. I can't touch my chest anymore, but like, there's like 4 or 5 more reps of stimulus that like, that's not costing me, my forearm's not burning. Like, and are you feeling more and more these days that you're just so aware of that stimulus that's there?
Yeah, no, 100%. It's back in the day, like I'd be doing these short overload movements and I'd go to failure and I'd be like, wow, that really hurts. Like that was a great set, because you feel it and you're like, I couldn't have done any more. And so that was like, you check the box and you're like, quality set, I'm good to go. But now, yeah, I mean, as soon as you realize, and I don't know when exactly this happened, sometime in the last 5 years, where I realized that if I just try another lat pull down, I lose an inch. And then you're kind of like, okay, do I need to use momentum so I can like get it to my chest? Or is it like okay that I lost an inch? Okay, let's try again. Oh shit, now I've lost 2 inches. Should I have used momentum so that I get a full rep? Or like, is that okay? And it just goes down the chain. And eventually you've done 12 extra reps. That's actually the number I find on rows and pull downs. I find that I can do 12 extra reps from when I can no longer do a full range of motion rep. And that's like an insane number because I'll do a set of 8 and then get 12 partials and suddenly I've done 20 reps.
Yeah. And it's all about acknowledging that set counts more than one set without those partials. You can't be like, oh, it's just one set. And so we do need to acknowledge that they're like, and of course you do. That's the point. I mean, the point is to get more stimulus. That's why you're doing those extra partials. I think it's come down to like perfectionist ego of like, you got to do full range of motion. Like a lot of us were like kind of funneled into this like evidence-based philosophy of doing things the right way with full ROM. And then you see other people at the gym using partial ROM or less ROM, and it's like an automatic negative thing. And then you realize actually this might be a tool that maybe the people that I'm seeing at the gym are using, unintentionally. But actually the real issue is, and I don't actually think the standardization, I was going to say standardization is the real issue, but it's just a little muddy to track. And so I think that, like, I forgot who said tracking hygiene. That might have been the
Milo.
Yeah, who had said something about tracking hygiene, which I totally resonate with. I think that's being able to communicate how to accomplish tracking that and progressing in it is communicating that to somebody who is just not just learning to lift, but maybe new to this stuff. That's the real, I mean, both of us run group programs. And so we both wrestle with the same problem of like, I know this is good, but I need to communicate it in a way where it's digestible, because truthfully, I don't have to do this. People can make gains without like the partials and stuff. And so I'm going to push people to do this. I need it to be something that is tangible where someone can track it. How have you been doing that in your group?
Yeah, so we have not done the pre-established range of motion yet, where you're basically like, I'm going to cut range of motion at 60% of full and then just do reps to that point. I've actually just started experimenting with that myself in the last 2 or 3 months, but more like specifically in the last month. How about you? Have you messed around with that stuff?
Well, I know I'm guessing we've both done. So you introduced me to reverse drop sets, and reverse drop sets are in essence like a clean way to make this happen, because you do a rep match technique. And so we kind of have to apply something that feels very tangible for people to apply it and feel good about it. So doing something like a rep match technique makes it objective. And you had mentioned like a decided amount, like a percentage of the range of motion. I have not done that. I'm doing that for myself right now.
That's what I mean. I haven't done that in
Yeah.
the group
In
programs
the
either.
group,
Yeah.
we've done several lengthened rep match in an attempt to like get people to do lengthened partials without actually thinking too much about that standardization of range of motion, because they'll standardize it with rep count. And so certainly have done like a row. First set is a full ROM failure set. When your elbows don't pass your body, you're done. Second is go grab 10 more pounds and just match reps. Whatever happens, happens.
Yep.
And that's been super fun because, again, I think it's a clean way to do it. But there's probably something to, I think what I will do, the first one I will do will be something where it's really clean and objective, like a overhead pull down to the nose. I think that when I'm thinking about like what's going to trip people up is having different machines with different markings. And I think like an overhead pull down where you stop where the bar is at nose height. I feel like everyone's going to have that option available. Or like a curl where we're only curling maybe to
the forearms parallel.
Forearms parallel. Something that isn't going to have hundreds of people with 100 different machines with 100 different markings.
Yeah.
But might be nice and clean and objective. And it's been that's one of the challenges we have with the group program. But I do like that as the challenge. Yeah.
We so we do the same thing, add 20% weight, match the reps to the prior set. So that's perfect for short overload movements. One way we actually have done, and I hadn't thought about it like this, but for years we've been using, I guess, what would be called like a dumbbell X lateral raise, which is basically like if this would be a T, then you're more just like going out like halfway to form an X. And so we've been doing those for a while as the at-home swap for a dual cable lateral raise.
Sweet. I love that.
Yeah, so that's actually, I guess, the very first one that we've done with like the pre-established range of motion type thing, but we haven't. Yeah, that's a really good idea to use the lat pull down to the nose or something along those lines first. The way that Milo described it, where joints form a right angle, that's
Little Seedman shout out.
Is it? That's
well, Joel Seedman's all about like joint right angle 90 degrees
for
everything, it's just crack. It's hysterical that would be the point, but it makes sense. That's more identifiable.
I think intuitively that's where I stop most of my my movements anyways when I'm trying to bias the length and position with like a pre-established range of motion stop. But ultimately, man, like you said the other day, or you put a post up about it or something, like I am just the most intrigued by this research because it's novel. It's just like something new to experiment with. And God knows I'm looking for new things to get excited about after this long training. But also, as you said, for efficiency and just, now I can basically do, like today I did 4 sets of side delts, 5 sets of hamstrings, and 2 sets of quads. So I did like 11 total sets. I hit 3 muscle groups and I'm like completely trashed. And so before implementing some of these strategies and techniques and stuff, that probably would not have felt like sufficient volume.
Yeah. The pursuit of finding opportunities like that are objective and applicable. Like for me and you, I feel like I just in our own training, I might find some ways that are like slightly less objective, just and more intuitively progress. But I feel like just like we're doing like an incline dumbbell lateral raise where you're laying back and your arms are kind of like in an incline curl. They're an extension behind you and you're lengthened a bit. And we're only counting the reps up to 90 degrees. And after you can't do 90, you just fuck off with that. And you just pull up into the sticking point, wherever you feel that is. And you keep going until you literally cannot move your arm. And you just don't track those. And you just I find it to be a nice switch from numerical tracking to stimulus pursuit. It's like at the minute you can't do the 90 degrees anymore, I want you to turn your brain just into I'm getting stimulus. I don't need to worry about which rep it was or whatever. Perfect reps, get the stimulus. We don't need to track it. We can keep that standardized. Hey, you did 10 90-degree reps. We'll go for 11 next week. And after you get that 11th one, let's go into these lengthened to the sticking point reps. But that'll be a fun pursuit. And especially for at-home trainees who don't have necessarily as many opportunities to overload lengthened positions just by body position manipulation, cables, machines, different arcs. And we just have like dumbbells most of the time, or whatever, free weights, barbells and stuff. I feel like there's a big emphasis for the at-home trainee, a big opportunity for the at-home trainee to maximize and use their equipment in slightly different ways.
Yep, totally.
Let's talk about the rep range stuff, because I think one of the take homes was that, hey, if you're closer, if you're doing lower reps, you didn't have to get as close to failure. And if you were doing higher reps, you had to get closer to failure. Was that something you were surprised about? And what sort of thoughts came to mind when you thought of that, or when you heard that, when you read that?
Yeah, no, it wasn't really surprising. I feel like that actually is in line with some of the other prior research that I've seen across the way. And so that didn't surprise me first off. And then it just like makes sense because like I mentioned in the beginning when I was giving like the initial recap of this thing, as the reps get higher, it becomes more ambiguous whether you're actually at failure or not. Like, are you just thinking that, man, this leg extension really hurts because I've done 18 of them and I really don't want to do 27 of them, so I'm going to falsely slow down reps and let the lactic acid accumulation, essentially stop me before the muscle itself is at true failure. I think that's very ambiguous with higher reps. And then with lower reps, following what I said kind of about the effective reps model and looking at the literature with these, like, as you said, the checklist you have of big compound movements that are lengthened, overloaded, and potentially axially loaded, maybe lack stability, that all generally tend to get trained in that 5 to 8 rep range. There's just a ton of stimulus, and it's something that it's cool the literature supports it, but it's something that you can just feel. Like if you just train in higher rep ranges, man, the burn, I guess, could be a little falsely. It could lead you falsely and make you feel like you're getting something out of higher rep ranges, even if you're not. But when you're doing lower rep ranges, you can tell that maximal effort is required for you to complete a rep from the beginning. Like I do a 6 rep set of hack squats, and from the first rep, I have to be completely engaged, focused, and putting in maximal output to complete that first rep, much less to complete the 5th or the 6th rep.
Yeah, for sure. You are right where you're like, yeah, we could talk about theoretically why it's possible. I just put my group through a higher rep mesocycle, and they're cracking up that I posted kind of about that when you might want to use higher reps, and I did that. I gave my group that program, and then like they all joke that I like gave them higher reps and then ran off to Africa for my honeymoon and like just like absolutely murdered them and just like ran off on them. But they all experienced that, and it's cool to talk about theory, and we will. But like there is something to me. I think when you are talking about, okay, if you're doing higher reps, you're gonna have more metabolite buildup, more of these hydrogen ions, whatever. It's going to hurt more in a different way, in like an actual pain sort of way, versus not a little bit more of like a local actual pain versus like I literally can't move this thing sort of thing. And that introduction of more what I would consider the word pain, I think now predisposes people to be able to deal with that for longer or shorter based on their own personal pain tolerance. I think if I give you your 5 rep, 6 rep, 7 rep, 8 rep max on hack squat, you're going to see less variation in people's pain tolerance. Now, I say that there's probably still some variation of like people really be able to grit out hard reps, period. But I think the difference in like pain tolerance and pain threshold for people becomes more of an issue at higher reps. And so you're going to see just worse results because you're going to have a higher percentage of people who have quit because they don't tolerate pain as well. And all of a sudden they're 5 RIR, but it really burns. And for them, their pain threshold is lower. And so this introduction of pain, they're going to call it quits a bit sooner. And so I think that's something that we all have felt. The higher reps hurt more, and you're more likely to want to quit because it hurts. And in reality, if we did a set of 8, you might actually be able to push yourself all the way to failure without that actual sensation of metabolite buildup pain forcing you to stop. I also think you touched on a big one, which is boredom. Honestly, like you kind of said, if I'm doing a set of 6 hack squat, like I have to be I have to have a maximal intent from the get-go. And that to me is less fatiguing because the set might take less time. I have less reps versus like, if I'm doing a set of 25, I know that the first 20, like I can just chat with Jenna. And it's like, oh, okay, after the 20th one, now I need to like really be maximally intent with what I'm doing. And if I'm not talking to Jenna and I have 100% intent into every rep, I mean, Jesus Christ, that's fatiguing for 25 reps. That to me, and I'm going to ask Zach and Josh this too, but that idea that we're worse at assessing RIR and potentially worse at just getting to failure because there's this pain buildup. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but to me, it feels like it might muddy this finding a little bit. Like, it's because we're better at assessing RIR and we're actually better at getting close to failure. I think it would stand to reason that I'm not surprised that that getting actually close to failure and lower rep not needing to be as close kind of makes sense to me. It kind of makes me think that, is this just going like I'll pivot. Let me pivot. That a 1 RIR is easier to assess. Now, I'm not talking about rep ranges. Sorry, I'm talking about proximity to failure. That it's easier to assess a 1 RIR than a 5 RIR, right? And so the people in the study that were doing 0 and 1 RIR, people that were going to involuntary concentric failure, saw the best results. But is that, like, I also couldn't get out of my mind. Yeah, but that's because those people for sure did that. And you might be comparing them to people who subjectively thought they were at 5 RIRs. We might be comparing fucking involuntary failure to 11 RIR or something. And so I'm just like, yeah, you know, the people who failed involuntarily versus the people who thought they were at 3 RIR, like, I bet there's a huge gap between those, truthfully.
Yeah. You make it much more objective when you actually fail. No, that's a really good point as well. I actually have a question for you that I've been thinking about as well in regards to this, which is, in this study, they separated the buckets into those that essentially went to the point, like, call it 0 to 1 RIR, where they believed they couldn't make another rep, but they didn't actually try it, versus those that actually went and attempted a rep and then failed. Where you are in your journey training, how often do you think that you are at failure and don't try another rep and feel like you would have been wrong, and maybe like you actually could have gotten another rep, but you thought you couldn't?
Yeah, my knee jerk was to say never. That I'm so dialed in to, like, I suppose, what I'm capable of, that I'd be very, very good. That I could, with a very high level of accuracy, tell you that I'll fail on the next one. And that also goes back to the exercise it is, because I was talking to Jenna about incline curls this morning, and we were doing incline curls. And I know that the last 3 reps I did, I flexed my shoulder a bit and I, like, moved my elbow forward. And so, you know, I could have told you exactly when that was going to start happening, and voluntarily went into that a little bit, because I knew that my technique would adjust, my front delts would start to work a little bit, whatever. But on a length, like these movements, like lengthened overload compounds, low stability, axial load stuff, with a very high level of accuracy, I think I could, I suppose in saying that, I would devalue the actually going to that place, like, like, what we're talking about for the listener is, like, how important is it that you actually go down on your squat and don't come back up? Like, how important is it that you actually get pinned by the leg press, or pinned by the hack squat at the bottom, or pinned by the bench press at the bottom? Like, how important is it that you actually go to that point? Or how good are we, you asked me, but how good are people at identifying exactly when that place would be? The study did find that people who went to that point saw better results, I think, than what they call volitional failure, where they. So it stands to reason that most people aren't as good as you and me at identifying.
That was my assumption as well. But, like, at the same time, like, I wonder, my question really is, if you're really, really good at assessing that, and you know very confidently and accurately that if you go down to attempt another one that you're not coming back up, like, is there still value in going down there and trying that? And my guess would be that maybe minimally there's slight stimulus down there, potentially. I don't do it. Like, I don't go down and test myself, because
let's be real, there is stimulus there, right? You're just doing another eccentric of the squat, like that's stimulus, but worth it. I would boil it down to the exercise selection for sure. I think what I will say, just, I know you didn't say the opposite, but what I will say is that I quite like getting to involuntary concentric failure, let's say. I quite like doing that at all opportunities, where it is safe. And so, like, even, if it's a short overload movement, it doesn't happen so abruptly. You can usually push into a high percentage of the range of motion, and then that slowly drops off. And so you're kind of approaching this endpoint a little bit slower. You're seeing it coming. If you're doing something like a leg press, you might go from like a 2 RIR, you might go from like a slow-ish rep to a slower rep to you're done. You literally get pinned. And so it might happen a bit more abruptly. But in something like a mid-range movement with let's say like a lateral raise, or I mean, I know that that's technically a short overload movement, but it's not the full range of motion. So I'm always confused as to what to call that. But let's say a bicep curl is more of like a mid-range exercise where it's hardest halfway up. Yeah, when there's an opportunity to go to a point where I can't complete another rep, or to the point where the range of motion drops off notably and then, kind of craps out, like I find at this point, maybe it's the pursuit of efficiency, but I just feel comfortable going there. And you and I have been on the podcast before where like, I just don't feel like those extra couple are that fatiguing to me. It just doesn't feel like exponentially more fatiguing to me. I don't know if that's something you've changed your mind on at all.
No, I agree. I actually think the example you put of the incline dumbbell curl is an interesting one too, because I don't often sacrifice technique like that to get another rep, but it's something that I've been thinking about, like before you said that, even in the last few days, weeks, that maybe that's just like another way to take a muscle that in a safe manner past its technical failure point. Like, hey, let me just ask my front delt to help a little bit in a completely safe manner. And like in my tracking, if we're talking about like the importance of tracking hygiene or whatever, like I would count the full reps and then I would say plus 3 partials or 3 with momentum, or however you want to describe it. But I think that there's definitely value in doing that where it's safe to do so.
I tend to not track those, almost because like I tend to just like if I track it, I'm more likely to see it next week and feel like I need more. And then in that regard, with things where I'm like so close to failure and I'm actually intentionally modifying technique, I feel like I don't want to make another game out of it where I'm like, I'm doing a 4th partial. Like I just want that to me to be like, okay, like now grit your fucking teeth and do whatever you can today, sort of thing. And so if you're just tracking it and you can be super neutral about just like looking at it and not obsessing about like progressing with an extra partial, always you need to be really on top of your intent, because you can make a real game of it. Like you can make your partials more partial and all of a sudden get a 4th one and you're like, I didn't really do more stimulus this time. And and so I usually opt for like just an effort-based intent with some of those partials, unless I'm standardizing range of motion and actually counting those for sure.
What if you then forget the next week that you did the more flexed version of them and you just stop your set at failure, and then you go back and you're like, shit, I did so much less stimulus than the prior week.
That I'm going to that point for sure. I definitely would make a note that I'm doing that. Absolutely. I just haven't felt the more fatigue side of things at all. And as I think that could be because, and I think it could be confounded by the fact that I'm not flying close to the sun with my recovery capacity. And so like if there's a line at the bottom, which is a threshold needed to make gains, and there's a line that's kind of far above that, which is the most I could recover from, I'm at a place between those lines where if I go a little harder than I was supposed to, I didn't overflow. And so that recognition of like it, I know that the study didn't find what I'm about to say. They found that even people that were training with higher volumes saw better gains with getting closer to failure, but there's obviously a limit to that. And so I think my volume is so low that I need all of that stimulus, and I could recover from all of my sets being death defying. And there's something to be said about that, whether or not that's like an optimal, that's not necessarily the pursuit. But I think that that's a confounder. Both of us are on the relatively low volume end of the spectrum, and thus it is required of us almost to go to that length to make it worthwhile.
Yep, for sure. Keep it efficient.
Yeah, keep it efficient. Okay. Anything else that I wanted to kind of go through? Have you felt like there's anything in terms of exercise selection, new stuff that you've enjoyed doing lengthened partials on? Like I've seen maybe your hip extension lately. You talked today about sitting forward in the ham curl, which I think is always a tricky one, because I think that machine to machine, some of them are not comfortable to do that. The angle of the seat sometimes. And so anything lately? Oh, sorry. I'm going to ask you that question. You know what? Something that's been questioning me, that I've been questioning a bit, is people who are doing, I saw somebody the other day shitting on incline curls. And the knock was that at the absolute bottom when your arm is fully extended, if your arm is straight down, there's no tension on the bicep, which is a fact. And then the person said, do facing away cable curls instead. And then lined up the facing away cable curl, where when the arm is straight, it was directly in line with the cable. And I got to tell you, 99% of people you see doing a facing away cable curl at the fully lengthened position are directly lined up with the cable, where there is now also no tension. And that they reach in the mid-range at 90-degree elbow flexion. That's where they reach maximum tension, just like on an incline curl. So I'm not arguing that incline curl, man, if we could keep a little bit of tension there at the bottom, that it wouldn't be better. But this upset, I'll send you the post afterwards, but it was just like, yeah, don't do the incline curl, do this. And I'm like, that you've just lined up your elbow or your arm again with the line of force. And there is also at this point, so if you're going to do incline, if you're going to do a facing away cable curl, like you need to step forward enough such that that cable's actually not lined up with your arm at the bottom.
Yep, 100%. I actually just started doing them seated with like an incline cable curl. That was pretty fire. So stability. To answer your question, I guess the thing I'm most experimenting with at the moment is just kind of, as I said earlier, the 60% range of motion stuff with like the range of motion stop. And so this all came out of a conversation that I had with Milo. And he had called me out on a podcast and said that the way that I do lengthened partials isn't evidence-based because I go past failure. And this was actually before the data-driven strength meta regression came out. And so we were having this conversation and I was like, dude, the only reason that the way that I do partials is not evidence-based is because no one's actually studied them this way. But like to say that the way I'm doing them is somehow wrong or like improper it's
based on all of this research around failure that lacks so much context of the people that were studied, by the way, the untrained, like our whole basis of understanding of like how close you need to go to failure was built upon untrained individuals. And then also not with a nuance on exercise selection. And so this idea of like, you don't need to go to failure and thus you are going beyond failure. So you've kind of violated evidence-based is lacks both of those pieces of nuance. I think if you're shortened overload, it's never been studied. That's just never been
exactly. It's never been studied
of pushing into partials on a short overload movement. Like, I'm with that. Yeah.
So essentially what I got out of this conversation with Milo was that the pre-established range of motion is actually probably most applicable on movements that are lengthened overloaded, because one thing that's prohibitive about the way that I do partials is that I can't do them on lengthened movements because I've basically been only able to do them on short movements because you fail and then you keep going and you get some partial reps. His approach, pre-establishing range of motion, actually was kind of like a light bulb moment in my head because I was like, oh, I can do this on overhead tricep extensions, on dual cable lateral raises, on lengthened overloaded seated leg curls. Like you and I now have the awesome same X Mark leg curl leg extension machine. So now I can set that machine super lengthened and then I can still do partials on it. Whereas before I would be setting it up mid or short and then doing partials after failure. So it's actually been kind of like a revelation and just something I've now been experimenting with because like I still kind of hold to the idea that I'm not a fan of these pre-established range of motion partials for these big compound lengthened overload movements. Call it your hack, your RDL, your back squat, whatever. Milo seems to be doing them on those. I tried them and I don't know. Maybe it just takes practice and refinement. But I am opening up my brain and I'm accepting this as something I can use on isolation movements that are more lengthened overloaded. And then we'll see what happens from there.
You tried it on a hack, bottom 60% of the hack?
I did. Yeah. I did it on my pendulum and on my hack. And it was just weird. I've only done it once. I'm sure I would get better at it. So I don't want to like completely talk shit about it, but it was really hard as if that's like a good reason. But no, it was really hard. The breathing was hard to figure out because
that seems weird. The breathing.
I've gotten quite good at not locking out at the top of my hack squat and pendulum squat. Like I just kind of hit the top and release and descend. And I've got that down to like a good cadence now where I can breathe through it and stuff. But the stopping just above parallel threw me a bit for a loop.
Yeah, the breathing you'd have to like, it's almost subconscious now. You'd have to like redo that cadence for sure.
Yeah, I'm sure I would learn it and I'd get better at it, but I tried it. I wasn't a huge fan, so I'll push it off and maybe try again next cycle.
Would Milo take it to a point of getting pinned? Would he 60% that to the end, or just say, hey, 60% is my full run? I can't do 60.
He specifically uses this pre-established range of motion so that he can use RIR. That was his whole argument, is that my way isn't evidence-based because I'm not using RIR, and RIR is evidence-based. This was again before the meta, and I think like I talked to Milo when we were at N1, and it's not like he went back on that by any means, but I kind of gave him like a little nudge, and I saw him doing some lengthened partials after failure with Cass on the pull down, and I was like, oh look, Milo's not evidence-based, like going past failure.
Yeah, but once your argument, not that Milo's a brilliant dude, like once your argument for doing pre-established range of motion is such that you can use RIR, you throw out failure as a word. Now it's it needs total new context. Like now you're using a never been studied before approach with a never been assessed definition of failure, which is when I can no longer do 60% of the range of motion. So I get it from a standardization perspective. That I'm down with. Like I get that okay, when I can't do 60, 3 reps from when I can't do 60 is my 3 RR for this move. I'm down with that. But like, you've created a new thing there, and so going beyond failure on a short overload movement into partials in a high stability environment where there's no neurological fatigue really, or low amounts of cardiovascular fatigue, feels like we're just entering new territory. And I think that's it just strikes me as like, no, you got to use RIR. I'm like, yeah, but you just invented a new way to use RIR. Like the fact that you can, you can't apply RIR, which has been, we've established everything we know about RIR using full range of motion. Now you're using RIR in the context of 60% of the ROM. We just don't, it's a totally new thing. It seems like a totally new thing. Yeah.
Well, certain exercises are just different range of motion. Like I'm trying to think off the top of my head, but there are exercises that already exist that are just like a different range of motion than a different version of that same exercise. And so essentially he's just setting up a different point for what task failure is defined as.
Yeah. Sure, for tracking purposes, hygiene wise, totally makes sense. Totally. But like you can't refer back to literature that says 2 or 3 RIR is best and apply it to this lengthened 60%. I just feel like that isn't fair a correlate. Yeah,
it's taking like 2 evidence-based ideas and then combining them together into one. Yeah, it's interesting.
Standardizing it though, I suspect I might do something similar with my group though, like just for tracking purposes of like but I might even, I don't know, man, I might even have certain exercises where we start at 60 and you track when you can't do 60 anymore, but then you keep going for stimulus. Yeah, especially with a short overload movement. I'm just so cognizant these days of the stimulus that's just a little bit left on the table. Yeah.
Well, one interesting piece about the way that these different movements act differently when you're doing these pre-established range of motion partials, right, is that you're doing a really heavily loaded lengthened compound and you're actually using less weight than you would for the full range of motion. But when you look at a short overload movement like your row and stuff like that, you're actually using more weight than you would for the full range of motion. And then I've found for those like middle movements like the dual cable lateral raise and the face away curl and stuff like that, I'm actually pretty much using the same weight, whether it's 60% range of motion or full range of motion, which is also very interesting because it just goes to show that maybe there just isn't much going on in that like top 40% of the range of motion anyways.
That's an interesting finding. And you know why? You know what was something I found is that actually when I did my leg extension and I didn't make it more lengthened overloaded, and then I made it a little bit more lengthened overloaded, and it turns out I didn't actually need to change my weight very much. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. That I thought I was going to need to go heavier. I'm like, oh, I'm working more lengthened. I'm going to be stronger there. And I was like, wait a second, I failed at more or less the same point, which was an interesting thing. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. I'm looking forward to more of this, but only through a lazy eye of I want to be able to continue to lift 120 minutes a week or something and get as much out of it as possible. Yeah.
Yep.
I wanted to talk cardio stuff, but both of us probably have to get out of here. But we'll anything up on your race? How's training for that going?
Training's going great, man. I've really upped my cardio dose recently. I've gone up to 6 zone 2 sessions a week pretty much at this point. So I'm lifting 3 or 4 days a week and 6 zone 2 sessions and 1 like interval zone 5 session.
Awesome.
And I'm finally starting to see some good progress. So the lactic acid clearance, lactate in my legs, the issue that I've talked about a lot, where I just can't seem to keep a consistent cadence because my legs just blow up so quickly. That's almost completely gone now. And like, I wish I had a fucking power meter, because this would be a cooler story if I did. But I did the same exact loop that I did a month prior when I was only doing like 3 or 4 zone 2 sessions a week. And it was 15.2 miles per hour 4 weeks ago. And I did it in 15.8 miles per hour this time. And so, who knows? There's wind, there's other things like that, but 0.6 miles per hour in a 4-week period, it felt like I was much faster. The whole thing it was 52 minutes instead of 55. So I knocked 3 minutes off of it, and all the other metrics stayed the same.
Awesome.
So anyway, it's working. It's getting better. I'm getting better. I did a 27-mile ride yesterday, which was the longest one I've done ever. And kept all of my metrics exactly where they're supposed to be regarding like heart rate and output and stuff like that. So I'm feeling confident that at least my zone 2 is my zone 2. I had questioned, like every time I would do 45 to 60 minutes, I'd be like, yeah, I like kind of want this to be over. And it was more about boredom, but it was also like my butt hurts from sitting on the seat. And like, there's a number of factors that go into it, but it's cool to see that I could keep that pace for like another hour on top of the initial period. And I think I could have probably kept it for another hour or 2 after that. So all positive stuff. Seems like adaptations are occurring and I'm not losing any gains in the gym, which is cool.
Did you feel, let me know if you have to go at some point.
I'm good.
Did you feel like anything recently, whether it's the podcast that we were talking about, whether it's just further discussion and reading on, whatever, now that there's a difference where you're just like, hey, I'm doing cardio for health versus like, hey, I'm training for this event. Has your mind changed at all? And, we talked, and I think we were both not in our infancy, but like we were both high on like our first foray into seeking out information about this topic.
Yeah.
Have there been any like big bullets that you're like, yeah, I just gently shifted my opinion on X or Y or Z?
Yeah, I mean, that podcast I sent you has had a huge impact. I've listened to almost every episode on there now. I've gone like super deep dive. And so I've talked about this on another podcast too, I think on my own and another one, but I almost feel like ignorant and naive to have basically just taken what Peter Attia and Inigo San Milan say and just be like, wow, look at these guys. Like, this is amazing. And it's not that they're wrong. The thing is like they're not wrong in the way that they're talking about it. And they are using evidence. It's just like, I feel naive that I didn't look at this the same way that I look at strength training and weightlifting. Yeah, you're nodding your head like you agree. It's like, of course there's got to be nuance and different things involved in here that like I'm just not grasping because it's too new for me. And so yeah, since listening to more of that podcast, I've been listening to Alex Viada a little bit. I've been listening to Alyssa Olnick, and the idea of critical power. That's such an interesting concept in that like you can either do something forever or you can't do it forever. And so trying to define zone 2 as like basically you could go forever. It's like, no, you fucking can't go forever. Like you couldn't even walk forever. And that's like the bottom of zone 1. So there's going to be a point in zone 2 where lactate accumulates. It's just a matter of like where and when that happens. And then, listening to the experts there, it's like, even within that one podcast, which I appreciate about the host, is he's brought on, Andrew Coggin on one spectrum, who's like, any zone works, right? Like it's a matter of balancing intensity and duration, and it'll all work, and mitochondrial function and all that good stuff. Then you had Dr. Joyner on, who actually was on Atia's podcast as well. And he has this theory that all roads lead to Rome. Because in Tokyo in 1964, there were 3 finishers in the 1500
I think
meters.
no, I think it's Yeah, it might be 1,500 meters. Yeah, it's not
And
more
they
than that though.
Yeah, they finished 1 foot apart from each other, and one of them did intervals, one of them did long distance steady state, and one of them did like some sort of hodgepodge mix of all of them, and they all finished 1, 2, 3. And then you had this other guy, I think his name was Steven Seiler, come on, and he was you listened to that one too, and he was talking about the polarized model where basically 80 or 90% of your time should be below VT1, and VT1 is like the beginning of zone 2. And so he was saying 80 to 90% of your time should be below VT1, meaning you're essentially in like the top end of zone 1. And then 10 or 20% of your time would be spent at like race pace or like doing intervals and stuff like that. And he, encourages you not to spend so much time in the middle. And so kind of just digesting all of that and taking it all in and applying it into my own, I think it's all just been super helpful and has increased my understanding of the cardiovascular for health as well as for performance.
Yeah, the big one is the ignorance. The audacity that I had is striking. And what I feel is that this is often sometimes what happens. And then the one analogy that came to mind for me was doctors who talk about nutrition. And it was like I had just enough knowledge to be dangerous. And it's not that it was wrong, like you said, it just was not said with the level of uncertainty that it should have been said. And I've been working with Alex for a bit, and there's just not as clear a cut, like you just said, there's not a clear cut way to go about this. And what I'm realizing is that when it comes to hypertrophy, I get goosebumps because I think that there's such an interesting polarization or difference between the two of them. Hypertrophy, I have just another, which I felt for a while, but an even more love for it because of how simple it is compared to a performance pursuit of any kind. Like bodybuilding is the performance version of hypertrophy training, and it is still just about there's no performance aspect. There's an accretion of muscle tissue is the only adaptation. Now you can get it where you want it and lose fat and stuff, but you're not performing in some way. You're not trying to get physiological adaptations per se, lactate clearance or different amount of capillary densities, or for the most part, you're like trying to do a lot of really hard sets and eat a lot of food and sleep a lot and get muscles in the right place to get the proportions right. But there's just such a difference when it comes to performance. And when we're talking about endurance events, there are so many potential limiting factors to someone's performance. It's like your ability to your anaerobic capacity, your ability to how high your air quote lactate threshold is. Like how hard can I work before we see a steep rise in lactate production? Your ability to maintain running form while under fatigue. There's so many adaptations that. And like I read one thing on polarized training. I'm like, oh, this is the way to go. I watched one YouTube video on polarized training. I'm like, oh, this is it. And then you find out that there's people doing, a mixed bag of things everywhere. From a theory that I found quite interesting was this. It's almost like a shape where it's like a triangle. So it begins like, let's say your race is over here on the right. You'd begin with very polarized training where you do a lot of low intensity and a little bit of very high intensity. So if you're running the mile, you might do a lot of sprinting and a lot of maybe not sprinting, but very high intensity work and a lot of low intensity work, and you would move closer to more time spent at race pace as you got closer to the race. So almost like a general to specific, but not just general on the polarized ends, and you would move closer to a race pace as you went. And it's like people are like, yeah, that can work, and then there's like block periodization. We're like, yeah, that can work. And the uncertainty of it is a little it's a little unnerving actually, because it'd be nice if it was, as I'm learning it, I'm so hungry to learn, but it's not a nice prepackaged thing. It's not. The way Alex works and the way Alyssa works and the way Peter and Inigo would do it and the way, I just read The Science of Running, which I think you would enjoy. I thought it was a good book. But there were certain things in there that I'm like, yeah, this guy has an idea of doing it a little differently. And so I'm trying to work back from, I've rewritten, I don't know about you, but I've rewritten my zone 2 suggestions in my group like 3 times now, because
3 times.
Yeah. Because it's like, okay, if you worked a little harder than normal, like you get this like post exercise oxygen an overshoot or whatever they call it, where it's like you're still getting mitochondrial adaptations. It's not like like what I've learned the most that I would want to share with people is the benefit of zone 2 training. The biggest benefit is that you can do a lot of it without it being fatiguing. It's not that, like I have said on the podcast, that like the point of zone 2 is that you're not burning a lot of carbohydrates, you're not making a lot of lactates, you're not blunting glycolysis or lipolysis, so that you're getting more mitochondrial adaptations, and that's all kind of happening. But the point of zone 2 is that it's easy enough that you can do a lot of it and recover from it, and not get muscle damage and not get limited by local muscle fatigue or local metabolite buildup or local muscle metabolism, whatever way you would want to call it. And it's like, it brought me back down to earth of like, all right, like these are like man-made constructs, not based in unbelievably ironclad science, meant to provide an athlete with structure, not such black and white lines. And that's been like, I almost want to re-record a new podcast, which may be fun, we could do, of like, but even then I would be like, maybe we were still treading that line of,
we'll have to do another one in like 6 months after that. So
yeah, but it's good. It was definitely humbling of like, I'm like, how dare I, how dare I,
No, I felt the same way. Exactly. But like, it's all part of the process of learning. And like, we obviously still don't know half of what we need to know,
Do you find that too, though, that your pursuit of this performance event is way more, I don't know, just not difficult, but like I have I've never trained for a performance. Not that I'm training for an endurance event, but I'm just like learning more and doing some of it. But like I've never been a power lifter. I've never been an Olympic weightlifter. I've like dabbled in, physique based pursuits, but I was a soccer player, but I never really played for, half a season in college. I never really bought into like watching myself improve and figuring out where I was weak and getting better. And I really have a newfound respect for like that pursuit and how difficult it can be and complex it can be and psychological. I mean, there's all this stuff about all the way down to like telling people that they're running faster, that their splits are faster, like makes them run faster. And there's so many of these like central governing model, like Tim Noakes central governing model. There's so many different, and there's people that are like, yeah, that makes sense, but it's a man-made construct that isn't based in like super ironclad science. And I just have a new respect for the pursuit of a really performance-driven outcome with fitness. It's not something I've dabbled in a bunch.
Yeah, I've done it a decent amount through the competitive CrossFit years. And it's actually funny because when you were talking about that model of starting at more endurance and then more anaerobic and having them meet in the middle, that's actually the way that I programmed competitors in CrossFit and programmed my gym when we were setting up to compete. We would start at one end with alactic anaerobic, and it would be like, 10-second, 15-second work with 2 or 3 minutes rest in between each interval. And then on the other end, you'd have like 60 minutes of steady state. And then each week over the course of like a 10-week cycle, they would get closer and closer and closer together until you're essentially at lactic threshold. And that would be like, hey, you're ready to go for 7 minutes and like hammer shit. So it's an interesting way that you frame that and just brought me back to that. But as far as training for my race, man, it's just been fun. Like it's just been fun to see adaptations occur so quickly. And I haven't experienced rapid adaptation like that in many, many years. I mean, since I first started performing Olympic lifts in CrossFit, maybe 2009, that's when I last saw rapid progress. And so it's just been fun. It's been cool. And I am enjoying it and looking forward to the race. I mean, the race isn't until October, so I still have a really, really long time of continuing to hammer this, but it's not just about performance. It's also health and blood markers. And I'm looking to see whether it does increase some of these functions and things that I'd like to see if it does,
Cool. All right, man, let's get you out of here. I would be interested in maybe after the race is over for us to sit back down and be like, just where a full update on our thoughts, come full circle on our experience.
Yeah.
I think I've taken a step back from talking about it so much, just in a sense of like, I'm really at the infancy of learning about this stuff, and all good. It's good to be humbled every now and again. Really like found a new appreciation for it for sure.
Yeah, I 100% agree.
Cool, man. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. We're gonna have to talk Colorado stuff pretty soon. I'm coming out there for I was supposed to come out in September for the program design course, but Jenna's brother's getting married that weekend. So I just emailed them. They're going to let me move to another, probably a biomechanics anatomy course. I'm watching people go for the second time. And when I went, they didn't have any equipment. They just had the functional trainers. And I'm like, fuck, man, I think I just got to.
They have everything now.
I think I got to go back for that. So I think I'll head out there. And when I do, come by and say what's up for sure.
Yeah, for sure. All right, brother. Sounds good.